I want to briefly spend some time on the three topics I show here on the left-hand side. The role of CINTAC. Judy in her presentation mentioned that briefly, that I'm the chairman for the current period of CINTAC. Talk a little bit about U.S. nuclear export controls. That was again mentioned right before, in the sessions before lunch. And then also talk about nuclear safety opportunities moving forward. I need to figure out. So CINTAC, the Civil Nuclear Trade Advisory Committee, is an advisory committee to the U.S. Department of Commerce. There's quite a number of advisory committees to the U.S. government. Department of Energy has also an advisory committee for nuclear power. It's under the executive branch of the U.S. Department of Commerce. The CINTAC was originally authorized, it's a relatively new advisory committee. It was authorized in action in 2008. That was an election year, so it took a little while first to get a new Secretary of Commerce, and then once the organization was in place, then to actually get CINTAC rolling. So although it was authorized in 2008, that first CINTAC did not actually convene until 2010. Craig Hansen from Babcock & Wilcox was the chairman for that first CINTAC, and in a relatively short period of time, in 2010, we produced a relatively robust set of recommendations that we delivered to the Secretary of Commerce. The organization, or the committee, was re-chartered in 2010 with a full charter this time, from 2010 until September of next year, again with the same mission of advising the Secretary of Commerce on issues related to nuclear trade, and we'll talk about those in the next slide. There's currently in this CINTAC 30 members representing industry. As you mentioned, BJ is on the committee, and there's a number of others from Westinghouse, General Electric, down to small and mid-sized organizations like ours in every sector: fuel, components, legal, all aspects of nuclear trade. I'm the current chairman of the committee, and Jeff Benjamin, formerly of CH2M Hill, and now an independent consultant, is the current vice chairman. So we've basically divided ourselves into the following subcommittees. Into these subcommittees, we advise on issues of treaties and regulations, so that would include the Part 10A regulations and advice that we give to the Secretary there, nuclear liability and the issues around that, technology, to talk about the different matters related to technology, domestic competitiveness, how U.S. companies can remain competitive in the global marketplace, talent and workforce issues, advocacy, both our government working with, for example, the Indian government, as well as advocacy with industry, which is partly what we're doing here over these 3 days. Issues related to financing and to the fuel cycle. And so that's really the role of CINTAC, and if you have any further questions about it, you can come to me independently. Again, our advice is to the Secretary of Commerce. They work through their interagency process with the Secretary of Energy, with State Department, so many times there's an interagency process that goes, but our charter specifically advises the Department of Commerce on those issues. I want to talk a little bit about export control, and a lot of this may be very familiar territory, but just very, very briefly to touch base, to maybe add clarity, maybe confusion, hopefully not, on export controls. There's 3 primary export control regimes in the U.S. that affect nuclear power. There's a few others as well, but these are the 3 primary ones. There's a set of regulations under the Department of Commerce, the EARs they're called. Then there's the Department of Energy regulations, fondly called the Part A10 regulations, under 10 CFR A10. And then for the export of components, the NRC regulations under 10 CFR 110. So just to talk briefly about those, so this set of commerce regulations govern the vast majority of exports from the United States. By far, most exports out of the United States are covered by the Department of Commerce regulations. It's a very streamlined process since there's so many that are done, covering every sector of the economy. It's very streamlined. It's an online process for application and things like that. It's usually a very quick process if the ECCN is known, the ECCN being the number that's given to a specific component or technology. And although securing that determination, that ECCN, can be a relatively lengthy process. Then there's the Department of Energy, what is well known and debated here, the Part 810 process, which is administered by the Department of Energy under NNSA. It's a letter licensing process, so there's no formal online application. Basically, write a letter to Rich Gorovich and his staff and ask for permission to disclose technology. It's got a much higher degree of confidentiality maintained. You know, the federal government generally is very public in its dealings, but NNSA and the Department of Energy don't necessarily have the same disclosure requirements as, for example, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission does. It can be a relatively lengthy process due to interagency and foreign assurances, and I'll talk about that briefly as well. And then there's the NRC Part 110. Again, a well-defined application process. The forms are all available online on the web. It's a very public process. If there's proprietary information, it's going to be included. There's very special requirements that you have to adhere to try to keep those necessarily out of the public sector if you need them to. It also can be a lengthy process, again, due to the same issues of interagency. This is my customary, every PowerPoint has to have a slide where you can say, I know you can't read this, but, so this is my contribution in that regard. But this describes the relatively complex process of nuclear export control. So if you start really from the top, we submit an application to the U.S. licensing agency, to Commerce or Department of Energy or to the NRC. They take it, if you're kind of following this clockwise, have an interagency process, and once that interagency process is determined that yes, we're going to pursue this license or allow this license activity, they'll take it to the State Department in the country that they're coming to, for example, India. They'll solicit foreign assurances from the corresponding government. They'll take those assurances then, and that has to then go to the end user, so the foreign government, if the technology is to be disclosed to a private sector company, would have to solicit assurances, and those assurances are to prevent the proliferation of the technology for strategic uses or to other countries that weren't authorized by the United States. And then the process sort of comes back again, back through the U.S. government, back through the State Department, back to the licensing agency, and finally back to the applicant, to us. So it's a relatively, a lot of handoffs in that process, a lot of areas in that handoff for things to break, but it's our process that we have. And that's a relatively similar process for all of the licensing. The Commerce regulation is a little more simplified than this. So it's time for, we need to wake up after lunch. It's time for a pop quiz. I'd hand out pieces of paper, but we don't have time to see how everyone scores. So identify the country from this list of attributes. So a country where there's nuclear N-S technology from 4 different foreign suppliers, foreign countries, with a highly successful indigenous nuclear program as well. A country that within U.S. export regulations is a restricted country, so has special restrictions put on it. Very unique country-specific laws about nuclear liability, not signed up to the CSC, has their own nuclear liability regime, has a framework for government assurances on technology transfers in the private sector, and has a very strong initiative for localization, and with all these things has a significant nuclear trade with the U.S. Any volunteers care to identify the country? China, exactly right. My point being not to raise China and bring it up in India, other than to say, well, if it can work between the U.S. and China, two countries with significantly different political agendas and systems, if it can work there, then we must find a way for it to work between the two countries, as we often say, the world's largest and the world's oldest democracy. We ought to be able to figure this out. If we could figure it out with China, there's no reason that we shouldn't be able to figure it out between the U.S. and India. I want to give just, again, to go now into nuclear safety very briefly. I've only got a couple slides left. And I will confess this is a little bit of marketing. So there are issues, for example, that can be handled right now. It's been mentioned by a couple speakers, in nuclear safety and opportunities. And I'll bring up one, and I happen to bring this one up because this is something our company does, and I'll bring it up in, for example, ECCS suction strainer operability. This is a huge issue around the globe right now. The NRC and the U.S. industry has been dealing with this issue for more than 20 years, and it's still not done. New issues keep coming up with this issue. There's currently resolutions underway in the U.S., in Europe, in Canada, Japan, China, South Korea, everywhere. Every commercial operating plant in the U.S. has done a retrofit to replace their containing ECCS strainer. I know that because we did a lot of them. There's 100% retrofits are currently mandated in Japan, who's about 80% done with doing their retrofits. China, who's currently installing huge strainers in their new plants and is just starting to go back to retrofit, and South Korea is in the same boat. There's current technical issues about blockage of the core, so everyone replaced strainers, but now they're finding out from some new testing that was done in the U.S. That there's possible core damage possible by debris that passes through the strainer and gets onto the fuel. So now there's some additional backfits that may be close. The NRC was very close to issuing some mandatory backfit requirements, but has backed away in the past few months and is looking, giving the plants a few more times. And this is an issue that's applicable to BWRs, PWRs, including the Russian VVERs, and pressurized heavy water reactors. We just secured a contract in China for their VVER reactor. They had initially gone back to the original vendor and asked them to help with the resolution, but this isn't an issue that in Russia has really been brought to light. So they came to us, the American company, because we've got a lot of background in this, to actually help them implement the solution in the plant in Russia, in Tianwan, which is very similar to the VVER here. And here's the main point. This does not require a 10 authorization. This, up until about 6 months ago, did, but we went and basically appealed, which again, with the Department of Commerce, is a very well-established process, to get it reclassified from requiring an 810 license to requiring a Department of Commerce license. And that's a huge difference because the level of assurances we need to solicit from foreign governments, or that our government, is much, much different. It's a much more streamlined process, and one that could proceed today. And aside from our scope that I'm talking about here, there are a number of issues, a number of things that can be done in the existing fleet in both countries that does not require an 810 license and yet enhance the nuclear safety of the plants. So I would just again bring up, and this is pretty much my last slide, just this gets into the specific issue I'm talking about. All this process can be done in a Department of Commerce, relatively streamlined process that starts up in the upper left-hand corner there, that includes pretty significant analysis work of interactions going on in containment, testing for the solution, fuel assembly blockage testing, which again we're doing in China for work on the VVER work there, all the way down to, in the case of what's shown in the bottom center there, replacement of the actual strainers. The one you see in the picture there is actually the size of the strainer. Kind of the blue and yellow is the size of the strainer. So this is not a small component. This is a component that fills the basement of the containment building. All the way to the next step, which is potentially having to reduce the source term, meaning the debris generation. So in that case, taking out a lot of the fiber insulation and installing a metal reflective insulation, which, by the way, we also happen to do. So all this, done without the requirement of an 810, can be done today in the Indian market, and Indian companies can work with American partners in the American market. So I guess the point, as several of the speakers mentioned it, there are opportunities today. New nuclear reactors are going to be phenomenal, but there are many opportunities with Indian industry and American industry that could move today. And so we need to look for those opportunities again. As the two biggest and longest lasting democracies, we ought to be able to figure this out. And with that, I'll thank you and turn over to the next speaker.